Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
So I have brought a piece from In These Times to the table for us to talk about today. The piece is called Democratic Leadership Still Hasn't Caught Up with the Party's Base on Gaza. It was written by Stephen Zunes, who is a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. And I actually looked him up. He's got a few areas of expertise, including Middle Eastern and North African politics, U.S. foreign policy, and social movements. So right here. And he's also written several pieces for In These Times, though I think this is the first one we've read for our pod. So that's exciting. So this piece is all about the Democratic Party's continued support of Israel's war crimes and genocide against Palestine and the Palestinian people, despite the overwhelming desire from the party's base in wanting the exact opposite of what is taking place. And so Stephen actually says something early on that I thought might set the tone for where we are in terms of where the Democratic Party's leadership is in comparison to its base in regard to Israel and Palestine. So he says, quote, recent polls have shown 78% of Democrats support recognizing the state of Palestine, which 3/4 of UN member states, including some of the United States' closest allies, already do. Similarly, 75% of Democratic voters oppose sending additional military aid to Israel, which is already illegal according to Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which bars the United States from providing military assistance to countries blocking humanitarian aid. Still, at its August meeting, the DNC Resolutions Committee voted down a resolution calling for recognizing Palestine and suspending military aid with a decisive margin. And, you know, that's beyond disappointing, right?
Yeah.
And incredibly infuriating to say the least. But that, I think, really set the tone for, his analysis and what he offers in this piece. So I wanted to share that. And I think there's a lot we could talk about from this piece. So, where do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought this was a great piece that highlights some of the differences between Democratic leadership and the people who are actually voting Democrat.
Yes.
Which, we can call a base, but we can also say that there are people who vote Democrat maybe unwillingly. So
yes.
I think the piece you highlighted there about how 78% of people support recognizing the state of Palestine and 75% of Democratic voters oppose more military aid to Israel really demonstrate how misaligned policies are with voters.
Yes.
Those are very stark differences. And Stephen goes on to talk about what happened after the resolution you mentioned failed. He says, quote, DNC Chair Ken Martin and 17 other top party leaders successfully pushed through a different resolution, which, while advocating a two-state solution, insisted the creation of a Palestinian state only come through direct bilateral negotiations. Critics, however, note that no such direct Israeli-Palestinian talks have taken place for more than a decade, while the current Israeli government categorically rules out Palestinian statehood. Combined with the DNC's objection to conditioning aid to Israel, this appears to have been a de facto endorsement of ongoing Israeli control over and colonization of the occupied territories. And I think this is party officials trying to have their cake and eat it too, to look like they're doing something but really do nothing.
Yes.
The reality of it is that what Israel has been doing over the last 15 to 20 years means that continued unwavering support for this government is signing off on ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
And that's just focusing on the settlements and removal of people from their homes in the West Bank and the literal enclosure of Gaza that made it an open-air prison, not to mention the 2-year systematic destruction of Gaza that has been going on since October 7th, 2023, all of which is also happening on top of 77 years of violent displacement and removal of Palestinian people from Palestine. So they want to ignore that history and the present.
Yes.
That's well documented.
The active present.
And move forward as if what's happening is normal and acceptable and just say, well, we need bilateral negotiations to talk, as if there doesn't need to be some kind of intervention to stop what's happening and rectify it and address it. Yeah. And it's just, well, no, let's bilateral. And it feels like a resolution that removed all recognition of
Yes.
what's actually happening and the actual conditions that any of the people are going through there.
Yeah, it's so out of touch with reality to think that and to advocate for, what did you say, a two-state solution and bilateral negotiations. Like, how in the world can Palestine really do that when their people are being, murdered and massacred every single day, and they have no infrastructure and no hospitals and children are dying? I mean, it just, the one state of the two states is actively destroying the second state. And so in what world is that possible?
Also killing the leadership that might participate in a bilateral negotiation.
Right. Yeah. It was so tone deaf to see that, and tone deaf, not even the right word there. But yeah, one of the pieces of this article that was really fascinating to me was Stephen highlighting how we've been here before in this place where the Democratic Party's leadership is completely out of touch with its base and what its base wants to see happen. And we've talked about this before, this idea of history coming around to repeat itself. But he shares, quote, "There is likely no other issue where the party leadership is as out of sync with its base." Allison Minerly, a young DNC member who sponsored the defeated resolution, noted how only 8% of registered Democrats support the party's current position in support of Israel's war on Gaza. And the defeat was not for lack of mobilization. Members of the committee received hundreds of thousands of emails encouraging support for Minerly's resolution. Harold Meyerson, editor-at-large for the American Prospect, noted, quote, "We've been here before, widespread Democratic opposition to an outrageous war, particularly among the young, while a good chunk of the party's establishment remains unwilling to halt U.S. involvement in that conflict. In the 60s, that was Vietnam. Today, it's Gaza."
Yeah.
And, I just appreciated that reminder in comparison to where we've been before, right? And it's, as I said, it's always fascinating to me to see how history repeats itself. In this case, it's so disappointing, especially watching what we're seeing happen in Gaza and the tremendous loss of life and the destruction that's taken place there. And, while I think Stephen a little bit later on talks about in this piece about how there's been a bit of a shift in Democrats and Democratic leaders thinking on this issue and how they've become, quote, more scared of their constituents than they are of AIPAC. It's really so sad to me that it's taken so long, and you named the time frame there, so long for us to get here.
Yeah, and we're not there yet.
No.
I think that what you named is an important history to note, and the difference and separation between voters and politicians is an ongoing issue. They're consistently far behind the people on what's right or just, which is why so much work has to be done to get them out of office or to push the work forward or to push them and help them change, which is harder work than electing somebody who's already there.
Yeah.
And that's why the cultural work of education and art helps push the people, which then slowly pushes the politicians. And so we see this kind of cycle start to form, I think.
Yeah.
But Stephen notes that some people see even this much debate about a resolution like this as a positive.
Yep.
And so I think that's important context.
Yes.
So he says, quote, "According to James Zogby, a longtime DNC member and advocate of Palestinian rights, the Minneapolis meeting should be seen in a somewhat positive light as a result of the unprecedented level of debate and the fact that Martin felt obliged to withdraw his resolution. In a statement following the meeting, Zogby, president of the Arab American Institute, wrote that the outcome should be seen as a recognition of the shifting tides within the party and the reality that the status quo has become unacceptable and untenable. Supporters of Palestinian rights should understand that this was a victory and an important step forward in the long struggle for justice." I think Zogby here noting that this is a step forward helps contextualize how unacceptable criticism of Israel has been.
Yes. Good point.
And Stephen goes on to note another step forward that a majority of Democratic senators voted against sending more arms to Israel back in the summer. But it's not enough, and it demonstrates how fundamentally flawed our systems are when even having a discussion about recognizing Palestine as a state is progress in the midst of what Israel has been doing for the last 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other thing that stands out to me about that quote is this idea that it's, he names it as being the long struggle for justice. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
It's really disappointing and unacceptable and untenable, all the things that you said. And he said in this quote that it's taken this long to get here. But, we've talked a lot about history on this podcast, right? And we've had a lot of things, a lot of media that has given us that perspective that this stuff unfortunately takes time. It's awful to see what's happening in that time, while this is happening, while these debates are happening, and it takes so long to change opinions. But it is a long struggle for justice.
Yeah.
So I think related to that, he talks about what's been promising about seeing some Democratic leaders come out and push for particularly the stoppage of weapons transfers and also financial support from the United States to Israel. And it was also really great for me to learn more about some of the organizations and the PACs that are calling for this shift as well and are putting real pressure on Democratic leaders to make it happen. So Stephen says, quote, "It is not just the undeniable horror of the humanitarian situation in Gaza and increasing settler violence in the West Bank that are responsible for this shift. Credit should also be given to the widespread popular mobilization against U.S. support for Netanyahu, not only from traditional pro-Palestinian groups, but mainstream liberal and progressive organizations which have traditionally avoided the subject. Over 20 prominent groups aligned with the Democratic Party have formed the Reject AIPAC Coalition to push Democratic candidates to refuse money from AIPAC, an influential right-wing Zionist organization. For example, Peace Action, the largest multi-issue peace group, has long taken solid positions regarding Israel and Palestine, but only rarely made it a priority, and their PAC was willing to endorse supporters of Israel's war and occupation if they were progressive on other foreign policy issues. Now, however, they have been among the leading groups mobilizing against U.S. support for Netanyahu, having made it their number one issue over the past 2 years, and are pushing hard to restrict U.S. arms transfers. They are currently spearheading support for the Block the Bombs Act in Congress. And for me, this part of the piece was really fascinating because, it was nice to learn about some of the efforts of these organizations. And I definitely want to look more into that. It's probably a good idea for homework, actually. But I'm just really hoping it makes a difference sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I think seeing this shift in politicians and organizations calling for restrictions on arms and funds being sent to Israel is a good step, but ultimately may fall flat because I think that what that may represent is a defensive position. These are organizations that are ultimately still in favor of Israel being in full control of the situation. And so they want what's happening to stop because they want things to go back to normal, so to speak. So restricting arms and aid to Israel now in the midst of a genocide is absolutely necessary, but it could be that they want this current moment to stop so they can go back to normal before this concentrated moment of violence over the last 2 years. To call it 2 years a moment is, feels strange. But, and I see this kind of thinking reflected in our elected representatives. They claim that people like Netanyahu and Trump are aberrations of the system that they're in. But the reality is that they're just manifestations of those systems. They are fully of those systems and only exist in the way that they do because of those systems. They've been propped up and powered up because of the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal settler colonies that they come from. And I think that's reflected in what this quote Stephen has in the article says. So he says, John Rainwater, Peace Action's executive director, noted, how can Senator Chuck Schumer lead the Democratic Party against Trumpism if he sides with Bibi Netanyahu's worst authoritarian instincts? How can someone like Senator Cory Booker give anti-authoritarian speeches about fighting for the moral soul of the nation while he votes to keep the U.S. complicit in starving a people and other war crimes? This kind of hypocrisy has to be reckoned with as we move forward. That's got to be another step toward progress and ultimately liberation, is recognizing what are the things that people are arguing for and also why. Because if it's just to get back to normal, that's not acceptable either.
That's a really good critical eye on what it is that they're calling for and good questions to ask. And so, if we're just going to go back to the status quo, like stop the genocide, but go back to the status quo, that that led to the conditions where we are.
Right.
That ultimately led to the conditions where we are. And so we need sort of a full stop.
Yeah, and that was just a more slow genocide.
Yes.
It
Yes.
was apartheid.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's going back to the status quo is also not.
Right.
it's
And
not
where might that lead us, 5-10 years down the line? Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate that critical analysis there. And I think that kind of brings us and transitions us well to application. And so let's shift our conversation there. And how does this piece and our conversation about this piece apply to our everyday lives and work? For me, Stephen does the work of application for us in the way that he ends this piece. So he closes the article by saying, quote, historically, the Democratic Party leadership has initially been out of line with its constituents on key foreign policy issues, including in Vietnam, Central America, South Africa, East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan, as well as on the nuclear arms race. Eventually, however, the party's base has been able to force changes in position. It is looking increasingly likely that such a change may be in store regarding Israel and Palestine. The question is, how long will it take, and how many more Palestinians will have to die before it becomes a reality? And I don't know, I sort of read that and it stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, I don't think I have anything else to add to that.
Yeah.
The question he poses there at the end is all that we sort of need for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my application to that quote. I also, as you were reading it again, I thought of, okay, Vietnam, Central America, Southern Africa, East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, nuclear arms race. A lot of that is tied to Henry Kissinger. So that also just made me think about him and how much of a dirtbag he was, and how many
influence of
how many violent imperialist things he led us into across many decades,
and the tremendous loss of life and loss of humanity.
Violence and So that's one piece of my application, and I think the other piece is us, the people.
Yeah.
If the people are responsible for setting the moral course of the parties, then we need to make sure that they hear it. There's lots of great work that people are doing for this, whether they're in any number of organizations like the coalition that's working on Reject AIPAC, who are making it clear that what's happening now is unacceptable and is ultimately rooted in what we've decided has been acceptable for decades, even centuries, when we tie the settler colonialism of the U.S. to the settler colonial violence of Israel. And then we also see how this kind of violence is happening in our own country, with ICE raiding apartment buildings in Chicago, or ICE agents abducting people off the streets, or pointing guns at protesters down the street from us, and National Guard troops wandering around our cities when they're not abducting people and participating in ICE raids. None of this should be normal, and all of it is grounded in what has been normalized by our governments. And I think that's one of the biggest places where I think the people are out of step, or the politicians are out of step with the people.
Yeah, you got me there. I just was thinking about what's taking place in Chicago with those ICE raids in particular. And I mean, we've been talking about ICE and the impact of that stupid bill, that ugly, disgusting, stupid bill for a while now. But seeing what took place in Chicago was really saddening to me. But also even thinking about the National Guards and the National Guard deployment. And, we were in D.C. recently and we saw them patrolling, and it just was so jarring to be kind of out enjoying our night and to look over and see armed National Guards patrolling. I mean, it just is such a wild world.
It's very surreal.
Surreal. That's a great word for it. Yeah. Well, great application. Let's talk about homework. Let me pick myself up. No, it's good stuff. It's just the reality of the world. How do we want to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? I mentioned this at the jump, but Stephen Zunes has written several pieces for In These Times. And so I peeked through them a little bit, and I kind of want to check a few of them out. So a few of the pieces are, as president, Jimmy Carter was not a peacemaker. Another one was called From Gaza to Aleppo, a handy guide for defending war crimes. And last but not least, Trump's far-right Israel stance creates an opening for the left.
Okay.
And that's just a few. He's written a lot for In These Times. And so I really appreciated this piece. And so maybe we'll bring a few more of these to the table from him. But yeah, what about you?
Yeah, my homework is to read through a few of the articles Stephen has linked in this article to get a little more background on how the opinions of regular people are shifting and some of the organizations who are doing work to keep that shift happening.
I like that. Absolutely. I always forget about the links.
There's a lot of good links. It looks like.
Thanks for reminding us of that work.
Yeah.
All right, Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am bringing back Eyes on the Prize 3.
Oh, good.
This episode is called We Don't See Color, which is wrong. The description is, quote, academics and organizers reflect on the impact of a 1996 California bill targeting affirmative action and how a changing demographic landscape has affected school desegregation across the nation. I think this should be another great episode from Eyes on the Prize 3 and get us to talk about how desegregation ultimately has been stalled by lots and lots of forces, including, it sounds like, this bill.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm excited to get back to Eyes on the Prize. We're so close. I think this will be two more,
left,
right?
Yeah.
So, okay,
Episode
great.
5, this is 5, and then there's 6.
Awesome. Very good. Well, thanks for bringing it back to us. All right, folks. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everyone you know. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.